There is a castle in the Bavarian Alps that appears on more postcards than any other building on Earth. You have seen it. White towers rising from a forested ridge above a gorge, the Alps behind it, the whole thing, looking so precisely like what a child would draw if you asked them to draw a castle that for decades people assumed it was the template. It was. Walt Disney used it as the model for Sleeping Beauty Castle. Every time you see that castle logo before a Disney film, you are looking at Neuschwanstein. Every Disney park on Earth contains an echo of this building. Here is what the Disney branding does not mention. The man who built it was declared insane by his own government, by ministers who had never consulted a doctor who had examined him, based on testimony from servants who disliked him. In a process no court in Europe would have recognized as legitimate. He was removed from his castle by force. 2 days later, he was found floating face down in a lake less than waist deep. His physician was found dead beside him. The deaths were ruled suicide and accident within hours, before any investigation. The man who certified him insane was the same man found dead next to him in the water. No investigation was ever conducted. The castle was opened to tourists 6 weeks later. That is what this is, not the fairy tale. The other one. Chapter 1. The Knights of the Swan Country. 1,091,536. The rock on which Neuschwanstein stands has been the site of human fortification since the 12th century. What stands there now replaced something older, and what was older replaced something older still. And to understand why a 19th-century Bavarian king built a castle on that specific spur of alpine rock above that specific gorge, you need to know what came before him. The first recorded fortification on the ridge above the village of Schwangau appears in a document from 1090, a reference to Castrum Swangowe, the castle of the Swan Country. The name tells you what the place was: a hilltop military position in the foothills of the Alps, above the point where the valley of the Lech River opens into the Alpine, passes toward Tyrol and Italy. The Alps here are not simply scenery. They are a corridor. For centuries, anyone who wanted to move armies, merchants, pilgrims, or taxable goods between the Italian peninsula and the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire had to come through passes like the Fern Pass and the Brenner. And the valley approaches to those passes were governed from exactly the kind of hilltop fortification that existed at Schwangau. The knights who built and held this castle were ministeriales of the Welfs, a specific category of medieval German military nobility worth understanding. Ministeriales were not free nobles in the traditional feudal sense. They were legally servile, bound by hereditary service to their lord. In this case, the Welf dynasty that dominated southern Bavaria and much of Swabia in the 11th and 12th centuries. But in practice, they functioned as a military and administrative class with genuine local power, permanent fortifications, and hereditary succession. They were the system through which the great German dynastic houses governed territory. They could not physically occupy themselves. The Schwangau Knights controlled the Alpine passes, collected tolls from the merchants and armies that moved through, and provided military service to the Welfs in exchange for the right to hold their ridge indefinitely. What they did not anticipate was that the Welfs would lose. In 1180, the Emperor Frederick I, Barbarossa, the great red-bearded Hohenstaufen emperor who spent his reign forcing the fractious German nobility into some semblance of imperial unity, used a legal pretext to strip Henry the Christoph, Lion, the most powerful of the Welfs, of his duchies of Saxony and Bavaria. Henry was exiled. The Welf political structure that had underpinned the Schwangau Knights' position collapsed almost overnight. The knights were now ministeriales, without a lord. Their response was the standard adaptation of medieval nobility, faced with the extinction of the dynasty they served. They switched allegiance, attached themselves to other powers in succession, the Hohenstaufen, then the Habsburgs, then the Wittelsbachs, as Bavaria consolidated and, crucially, acquired direct imperial immediacy by the 15th century, meaning they held their castle and their territory as a direct fief of the Holy Roman Emperor rather than through an intermediate lord. This was a considerable elevation in status. It also meant that as long as the empire held its institutional shape, the Schwangau Knights were secure. The most culturally significant member of the family was Hiltbold von Schwangau, a minnesinger documented from approximately 1195 to 1254. 22 of his songs have survived in the great medieval German manuscript collections, the Codex Manesse, the Heidelberg manuscript, the Weingartner Liederbuch. He was a real poet of real skill in the tradition of Walter von der Vogelweide and the German courtly love lyric. His work dealt with the conventional meany themes, idealized devotion to an unattainable lady, the suffering of love, the contrast between the joy of service and the pain of longing, but with a personal register that distinguished him from mere imitators. His heraldic emblem was a black swan, which gives you the connection to everything that followed 8 centuries later. The Swan Country, the Swan Knight, the Swan King. Hiltbold composed songs at the court of Henry VI and Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen emperors, who represented the high watermark of medieval German imperial power, the emperors who controlled territory from the North Sea to Sicily, who administered Germany and Italy simultaneously, whose reigns were the moment at which the Holy Roman Empire most closely approximated the ambitions its name expressed. Hiltbold was not a peripheral figure. He was part of the cultural apparatus of the greatest empire in medieval Europe, and he lived above a valley in the Bavarian Alps, in a castle on a rock that would, 6 centuries after his death, to be demolished to build something better. The decline of the Schwangau family in the 15th century followed the pattern that medieval inheritance structures reliably produced. Too many heirs, too many partitions of property, too many disputes with too little to divide. In 1428, Ulrich von Schwangau divided the family's holdings among 4 sons. The arithmetic of inheritance in 4 directions is inexorable. Within 2 generations, the accumulation of centuries had been parceled into fragments small enough to be financially unviable. In 1440, Georg von Schwangau was forced to sell the family's imperial immediacy to Duke Albrecht III of Bavaria, retaining the castle itself as a mere burgrave, a caretaker paid to maintain someone else's property. He and his descendants continued living in the castle, but the ownership was no longer theirs. In 1521, the brothers Heinrich and Georg von Schwangau were re-enfeoffed with their property by Emperor Karl V at the Reichstag in Worms, a brief restoration of formal ownership that lasted only 14 years before the debts overwhelmed it. In 1535, they sold everything for 35,000 florins to the Augsburg merchant Johann Baumgartner. The family line died out in 1536. 450 years of continuous occupation of this ridge ended not with a siege or a conquest, but with debt and a notarized transaction. What happened to the castle next was the slow dissolution that follows when a building outlives its purpose. Baumgartner, elevated to the rank of imperial baron, had the lower castle extensively rebuilt between 1538 and 1547 by the Italian architect Lucio di Spazzi, who had previously worked on the Hofburg in Innsbruck. Baumgartner died in 1549. His sons ran into debt. The property passed through further transactions until it reached the Wittelsbach dukes by 1567. It was used for bear hunting. It served as occasional accommodation for the younger sons of the Wittelsbach electors who needed somewhere to live away from the main court. The 30 Years' War, which ravaged Bavaria between 1618 and 1648, left it deteriorating for lack of maintenance. Austrian troops plundered it in 1743 during the War of the Austrian Succession. The Bavarian court had it repaired to serve as the seat of a local administrative office, an estate care court without any particular investment in its preservation or use. By the early 19th century, the twin medieval ruins of the upper castles Vorderhohenschwangau and Hinterhohenschwangau, the original fortifications of the Schwangau line, had long ceased to be functional buildings. They were precisely what they looked: ruins in an alpine landscape, fragments of walls and towers standing against the sky. Visited occasionally by travelers on the emerging tourist circuit of picturesque Bavarian scenery, admired by romantic painters seeking exactly the contrast of medieval ruin and mountain grandeur that defined the aesthetic of the period. They meant nothing, officially, to the Wittelsbach family that nominally held them. They were the leftover stones of a dynasty that had sold its last acre 3 centuries earlier. Then a crown prince went for a hike. Chapter 2. The Crown Prince and the Painted Walls, 1829. 1864. In April 1829, a young man of 18 called Maximilian, Crown Prince of Bavaria, was walking in the mountains above the village of Schwangau and came across the ruins of Neuschwanstein Castle. He was immediately enchanted. This is not simply biographical color. It is the founding moment of everything that followed, because Maximilian's response to the ruins and to the spectacular landscape around them, the twin lakes, the alpine skyline, the Pellet Gorge, the whole theatrical alpine geography, was to decide that this was where he wanted to spend his summers. 3 years later, in 1832, he bought the ruins. In 1833, reconstruction began. By 1837, the lower castle, which Maximilian renamed Hohenschwangau, the High Swan Country, was rebuilt in the neo-Gothic style, under the architect Domenico Quaglio. Over 90 murals were commissioned from artists, including Lorenzo Quaglio and Michael Neher, depicting scenes from medieval German legend, the Nibelungenlied, the story of the Swan Knight, Lohengrin, the quest of Parzival for the Holy Grail. The swan, the heraldic emblem of the old Schwangau Knights, was woven into the decoration throughout. Quaglio died during the project in 1837, and the work was continued by Joseph Daniel Ohlmüller and Georg Friedrich Zieblend. Maximilian's project was not an act of architectural nostalgia in isolation. He was participating in a broader European cultural movement that expressed itself in Gothic revival architecture everywhere from the Palace of Westminster to Cologne Cathedral to the Château of Viollet-le-Duc, a romanticism of the medieval that was partly aesthetic, partly nationalist, partly a response to the disorientation of industrialization. The 19th century's industrial transformation was happening at a speed that shattered traditional social forms, guild systems, agricultural communities. The rhythms of pre-industrial rural life and the Gothic revival was, among other things, an attempt to anchor the present to a past that felt more coherent and more human in scale. Maximilian, who was a scholarly and genuinely thoughtful man, understood himself as restoring something real, the authentic medieval heritage of his dynasty in the landscape where it had once actually been. That what he was building bore the same relationship to the actual medieval castle that a stage set bears to a battlefield did not diminish the sincerity of the aspiration. Maximilian used Hohenschwangau as his summer and hunting residence. His wife, Marie of Prussia, preferred mountain hiking and created an alpine garden with plants gathered from across the Alps. They brought their children here every summer. The household was, by the accounts of those who knew it, warm in its alpine settings, in a way that it was not in Munich. The formality that characterized the official court relaxed somewhat against the backdrop of the lakes and the mountains and the shooting parties and the hiking. Ludwig and his younger brother Otto spent their adolescences here, and for Ludwig in particular, the landscape and its specific cultural associations became foundational in a way that is not overstated by saying it shaped the entire subsequent arc of his life. Ludwig, born on 25 August 1845, grew up looking at the murals on these walls: Lohengrin, and the Swan, Parzival and the Grail, Tannhäuser and the Venusberg. The medieval world rendered in paint on every surface, the Alps visible through every window, the ruins of the higher castles, Vorderhohenschwangau and Hinterhohenschwangau, the original fortifications of the Schwangau line, visible against the sky on the ridge directly above him. Every room he inhabited was a visual environment constructed around the myths of a specific imagined Middle Ages. Every window looked out onto those ruins against the mountain backdrop. Every mural put faces on the stories that the landscape embodied. The medievalist Christoph Schwinghammer, who has written on the cultural construction of the Swan district as a site of romantic meaning, notes that the specific combination of landscape and painted myth at Hohenschwangau produced a genuinely unusual childhood environment, one in which the boundaries between historical legend and visual reality were permanently blurred. Ludwig grew up in a space where the paintings and the view outside the window were in continuous dialogue. The swan in the mural and the swan on the lake, Lohengrin riding into the courtly hall, and the ruined towers of the actual medieval castle above him. These were not separate things for him. They were one continuous environment in which the legendary Middle Ages and the actual Bavaria occupied the same imaginative space. This is not madness. It is the specific cultural product of a childhood in a very specific place. The ruins above Hohenschwangau were not, to the young Ludwig, simply architectural fragments. They were the physical presence of the world. The murals described the actual stones where the actual swan knights had stood, decayed now, reduced to rubble, but real. He sketched them in his diary in 1859, aged 14. He was already seeing in the ruins something to be rebuilt rather than simply admired. His parents, meanwhile, were not the kind of people who compensated for emotional distance with physical warmth. Maximilian was absorbed in his scholarly interests and his administrative duties. Marie was devoted to her mountain hiking and her alpine garden and maintained the formal distance that royal convention required. Contemporary accounts of Ludwig's childhood describe parents who were present in the physical sense. The family was together here every summer and absent in the emotional one. The children were raised by tutors and governesses in the usual aristocratic manner. Intimacy was not the register the household operated in. Ludwig absorbed this early and responded by developing the capacity for imaginative life, the inner world, populated by swan knights and grail castles and Wagnerian myth. That would be both the great achievement and the great vulnerability of his adult existence. His parents were also, it should be noted, married to each other without warmth. The royal family chronicle kept by the castle's Castellan records numerous social occasions, hunting parties, mountain excursions. It does not record much affection. Ludwig grew up in a household where the most vivid emotional content was on the walls. In 1861, aged 15, he attended a performance of Wagner's Lohengrin at the Munich Court Opera House. The opera told the story he had grown up surrounded by. The music gave that story sound. The encounter was not entertainment, it was recognition. The boy who had spent his childhood in a castle decorated with images of Lohengrin heard Lohengrin sung for the first time and understood, with a completeness that would govern his life from that moment, what the relationship between art and the world he wanted to inhabit actually was. He attended Tannhäuser shortly afterward. The same. He attended Der Meistersinger von Nürnberg. The same. What Wagner's music did was give the visual world of the murals a sonic dimension that completed it, made it three-dimensional, temporal, lived in, rather than looked at. His father, Maximilian, died suddenly on 10 March, 1864, of pneumonia after a short illness, having had no time to prepare his son for what kingship would actually require. Ludwig II became King of Bavaria at 18. He was, by contemporary accounts, extraordinarily handsome, a fact that generated a public enthusiasm for the new king, that his cautious, bookish father had never inspired. The Bavarian public's response to Ludwig's accession was approaching euphoria. He was young, he was beautiful. He was, by all appearances, the king Bavaria had been waiting for. His first act as king was to have his secretary find Richard Wagner. Chapter 3. The Patron and the Composer. 1864. 1868. Wagner, in the spring of 1864, was 50 years old, in serious financial difficulty, and in legal trouble serious enough that he had been living in various forms of exile from German territories for 15 years, following his involvement in the revolutionary uprisings of 1848 and 1849. He had completed the first two operas of his planned ring cycle, but had no prospect of staging them. His debts were catastrophic. The greatest composer of the 19th century was close to finished. Ludwig summoned him to Munich within weeks of taking the throne. He paid off Wagner's debts. The amounts involved were substantial, running to multiple tens of thousands of florins. He gave Wagner a house on the outskirts of Munich. He provided a regular stipend that allowed him to work without financial anxiety for the first time in his adult life. He commissioned a festival theater where the ring cycle could be staged with the technical resources from the work demanded. In return, Wagner gave Ludwig access to the fantasy world. The music created an exchange that was, for Ludwig, far more valuable than anything Wagner received. The relationship was not simply patronage. It was, for Ludwig, the closest thing to friendship he had, or would have a connection with a man whose inner world he understood, and who, at least some of the time, understood his in return. Their first meeting took place at 10 a.m. on 3 May 1864. Wagner wrote afterward, "This king is unfortunately so beautiful and wise, soulful and lordly, that I fear his life must melt away in this vulgar world like a fleeting dream of the gods." This description, from a man who was primarily motivated by the need for money, contains nonetheless something that reads like genuine astonishment. A teenager with a crown had said to a middle-aged composer, "Your work is the most important thing in the world, and I have the means to make it possible." Wagner's astonishment was probably real. The relationship was also politically disastrous almost immediately. Wagner's enemies in Munich, the conservative Catholic establishment, ministers who resented an outsider's influence, people who simply found him personally insufferable, which many did, launched a sustained newspaper campaign against his presence at court within months of his arrival. Wagner, characteristically, did not confine himself to musical matters. He commented on Bavarian politics, offered opinions on cabinet appointments, used his access to advance views that were none of his business, and conducted simultaneously a passionate affair with Cosima von Bülow, the wife of his champion conductor Hans von Bülow, and the daughter of Franz Liszt, with a disregard for appearances that his opponents found extremely useful as ammunition. By the end of 1865, the pressure was untenable. Ludwig's ministers gave him an ultimatum: Wagner, or the government. Ludwig, in tears, sent Wagner away. He offered to abdicate so he could follow him into exile. Wagner, who understood what the patronage was worth and what abdication would mean for both of them, talked him out of it. Ludwig wrote to Wagner constantly in the exile that followed, letters of emotional intensity that remain among the most remarkable royal correspondence in European history. They are not the letters of a man writing to an employee or even a cherished friend. They are the letters of someone who experienced the relationship as the primary emotional fact of his existence. Wagner's private correspondence about Ludwig was considerably more calculating. He needed the money. He found Ludwig's total devotion gratifying in the way that absolute admiration is always gratifying, and occasionally alarming in the way that unstable people with power are always alarming. His diary entries describe the king with warmth that shades, in private moments, into something closer to careful management, the tending of a relationship that was the financial and practical foundation of everything he was trying to build. Dr. Ulrike Leuthäuser, a cultural historian at the Institute for Stadtgeschichte Frankfurt, who has written extensively on Ludwig's cultural patronage, characterizes the relationship precisely. Wagner represented, for Ludwig, the living embodiment of everything he believed art and existence were for. The operas were not entertainment, but revelation. They described a world that corresponded to the world Ludwig inhabited in his imagination, the world of the Swan Knight and the Grail Castle, and redemption through suffering and transcendent love. His relationship with Wagner was the relationship of a disciple to a prophet, but also of a patron who genuinely understood what the prophet was trying to do and had the resources to make it possible. The fact that the prophet was also a manipulative, financially reckless anti-Semite who exploited the relationship for everything it was worth does not diminish the artistic achievement that the patronage made possible. Ludwig's financial support of Wagner enabled the composition and eventual staging of the complete ring cycle, Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, the most ambitious single artistic project attempted in 19th-century European music. When the Bayreuth Festival project ran into financial collapse in 1874, Ludwig provided a loan of 100,000 thalers that saved it. Without Ludwig, the ring cycle would almost certainly not exist in its current form. Bayreuth would not exist. The entire subsequent history of German music and of the German nationalist cultural politics in which Wagner's work became enmeshed, with consequences that reached into the 20th century, would be different. Wagner died in Venice in February 1883, 3 years before the crisis that ended Ludwig's reign, having never set foot in the castle that Ludwig was building as, among other things, a temple to their relationship. The Singers' Hall at Neuschwanstein, the vast room on the 4th floor of the palace, designed specifically to recreate the Hall of Song at the Wartburg, where Wagner's Tannhäuser was set, was completed in 1884, the year after Wagner's death. It has never hosted a performance of Wagner's music during the lifetime of any king. When the news of Wagner's death reached Ludwig at Neuschwanstein, he had the lights in the Singers' Hall turned off and did not speak to anyone for 2 days. In 1868, the year before construction on Neuschwanstein began, Ludwig's grandfather, Ludwig I, had died, releasing the considerable funds that had previously been spent on the old king's appanage. This freed the resources that made the building program immediately viable. The timing was not accidental in any moral sense, Ludwig. I had to die before the money was available, but the biographical irony is notable. The grandfather, who had been forced to abdicate in 1848, partly because his own extravagance had made him politically untenable, freed the funds that allowed his grandson to embark on an even more extravagant program of building that would, eventually, produce the same result. Chapter 4. The Defeat That Built a Castle, 1866, 1869. In 1866, the political ground shifted beneath Ludwig II in ways that made building Neuschwanstein not merely desirable, but, in some sense, necessary. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 lasted 7 weeks. Prussia won comprehensively. Bavaria, which had backed Austria, was on the losing side. The peace settlement forced Bavaria to sign a defensive and offensive alliance with Prussia, whose practical meaning was that Bavarian military and foreign policy would henceforth be dictated from Berlin. Ludwig remained King of Bavaria in title. The Bavarian state retained its own institutions, its own parliament, its own administrative apparatus, its own army, in peacetime. But the substance of sovereignty, the ability to make independent decisions about war and peace, about foreign alliances, about Bavaria's place in the world, was gone. He was not a ruler. He was an administrator of a Prussian dependency. He had been king for exactly 2 years when this happened. 2 years of discovering that constitutional monarchy left him almost nothing he could actually do. The cabinet governed, the parliament legislated, the king attended ceremonies and cut ribbons, and read speeches written for him by ministers who had been appointed by processes he did not control. 2 years of discovering that his genuine interests, the arts, the theater, the private inner world of Wagnerian myth, were considered embarrassing liabilities by the political establishment he nominally headed. And now, on top of all of this, the discovery that the title he held had been definitively subordinated to Prussian power, and that there was nothing he could do about that either. The humiliation was not confined to the immediate military defeat. It was structural and ongoing. When Otto von Bismarck moved to complete German unification in 1870, engineering France into declaring war, winning in 5 months, and establishing the German Empire at Versailles. In January 1871, it was Ludwig II who was required to write the letter to the Prussian King Wilhelm, proposing that he accept the title of German Emperor. The letter was drafted by Bismarck. Ludwig was required to copy it in his own hand and sign it. He described writing it, in private correspondence that survived, as one of the most painful acts of his life. He was enabling the absorption of the German states into a Prussian-dominated empire he despised, and doing so in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the palace that was simultaneously his model for his third great building project, Herrenchiemsee. The palace of Louis XIV, the absolute monarch he most admired, was being used to celebrate the triumph of the constitutional order he most resented. Bismarck paid him for it. Literally. A secret payment arrangement known as the Kaiserbrief transaction, documented in later historical research, provided Ludwig with funds drawn from the personal fortune of the Hohenzollern dynasty, routed through the equerry Count Holstein to avoid the appearance of direct Prussian subsidy. Ludwig used the money for his building projects. This transaction reveals with considerable clarity the specific hypocrisy at the heart of his reign. In public, the dignified performance of a sovereignty he no longer possessed. In private, using the proceeds of that performance to build a substitute sovereignty out of stone. The man who was publicly sacrificing Bavarian independence was privately being paid by the Prussians he was subordinating himself to. He used the money to build medieval castles in the Alps. The irony was visible to him, which makes it worse rather than better. The Kaiserbrief money meant that a substantial part of Neuschwanstein was, in the most direct financial sense, paid for by Otto von Bismarck. The castle that Ludwig built as a refuge from Bismarckian Realpolitik was funded by Bismarckian Realpolitik. The stone walls of the unapproachable temple were raised on Prussian gold. The planning began in 1868. In February of that year, Ludwig's grandfather, Ludwig I, died, releasing considerable funds that had previously been spent on the abdicated king's appanage. In May, Ludwig wrote to Wagner the letter that is the founding document of Neuschwanstein's purpose: holy and unapproachable, a worthy temple for the divine friend. The word unapproachable is doing specific work. He was building a place whose defining characteristic was not what it contained, but what it excluded. Everything below the ridge, the Prussian alliance, the constitutional cabinet, the official duties, the whole apparatus of modern governance that had converted his crown into a ceremonial object, he intended to leave at the foot of the mountain. The ruins of the old Schwangau castles, the ones Hiltbolt von Schwangau had stood in 6 centuries earlier, the ruins that Ludwig had sketched in his diary aged 14, were demolished in 1869 to clear the site. The stones of the original medieval fortification were removed to make way for what replaced them. There is something worth sitting with in this. The authentic medieval castle, the actual physical record of the Schwangau Knights, and their 4 centuries of Alpine passage control, was destroyed to build a theatrical recreation of what an authentic medieval castle looked like. The real thing was replaced by a more convincing version of itself. Construction began in September 1869. It would take 17 years and would still be unfinished when it ended. Chapter 5. The Theatre of Stone Building Neuschwanstein, 1869. 1884. The first thing to understand about Neuschwanstein's construction is that it was designed by a theater designer, not an architect. The plans were commissioned from Christian Jank, a scenic painter and set designer at the Munich Court Opera House, the same institution where Ludwig had first encountered Wagner's work. This was not an oversight, it was a precise expression of intent. Ludwig did not want Neuschwanstein to be an authentic medieval castle. He wanted it to be what an authentic medieval castle would look like, in a Wagner opera idealized, theatrically heightened, designed for emotional impact rather than historical accuracy or military utility. The distinction between the two was exactly the point. Architecture as built opera, stone as scenography. The theater designer understood the assignment more completely than any architect could have, because the assignment was fundamentally theatrical. Jank's sketches were translated into workable architectural plans by the engineer Eduard Riedel, who began construction in 1869. When Riedel retired in 1874, he was succeeded by Georg von Dollmann, who served as chief architect until 1886 and was responsible for most of the completed interior. Julius Hofmann briefly took over at the very end. 3 architects, 17 years, and at the time of Ludwig's death in 1886. Only 30 of the planned 200 rooms were complete. To prepare the site, 8 meters of rock were blasted from the hilltop using explosives. The ridge was too narrow in its natural state for the building Ludwig had designed and had to be physically widened. Steam cranes hoisted materials up the mountain. At peak construction periods, approximately 200 workers were employed. Daily stonemasons, carpenters, painters, plasterers, ironworkers, each working on different sections of a building that was being designed and redesigned in real time as Ludwig's demands expanded. The costs escalated with each revision. Ludwig reviewed drawings obsessively, returned them with annotations, demanded changes to rooms already under construction, adjusted the iconographic program of the painted interiors as his thinking about the Wagner operas evolved. He was building and redesigning simultaneously, which is why it took 17 years and was still unfinished when he died. The rooms that were completed are extraordinary, in ways museum photographs cannot capture. The throne room, designed in the style of a Byzantine basilica, with a blue vaulted ceiling painted with stars, supported on red porphyry columns, a floor of nearly 2 million mosaic tiles depicting animals and plants, contains no throne. Ludwig died before it was installed. He never sat in the throne he had commissioned for the most magnificent room he had ever built. The golden candelabrum modeled on a Byzantine crown, the mosaic floors, the Byzantine saints flanking the apse, all completed. The throne itself, absent. Visitors today walk across 2 million mosaic tiles toward an empty dais where a throne should stand. The absence is more affecting than any throne could be. The room completed in every detail, except the one detail that would have made it a functioning symbol of power, rather than a monument to power never exercised. The Singers' Hall occupies the entire 4th floor of the palace and is the largest room in the castle, roughly the dimensions of a concert hall. It was built specifically to recreate the Hall of Song at the Wartburg, the setting of the legendary singing contest in Wagner's Tannhäuser, where the troubadours competed before Landgrave Hermann of Thuringia in the 13th century. The ceiling is a painted sky of deep blue. The walls carry richly colored scenes from the legend of Parsifal, the Grail Knight, the wounded Fisher King, the castle of Montsalvat, executed in a style that blends Byzantine solemnity with German romantic warmth. Ludwig planned to hold private Wagner concerts here. The king rode to his seat in a gondola across a small artificial lake that was never built. The lake was never built. Wagner was never here. The Singers' Hall was completed in 1884, the year after Wagner died. The first Wagner concert in this room took place in 1933, almost 50 years after Ludwig's death. The bedroom is neo-Gothic, at an intensity that approaches parody or would approach parody if it were less seriously meant. Every surface is worked oak, carved to resemble Gothic stonework. The bed canopy, the washstand, the mirror, the reading desk, all in the same register of secular-made ecclesiastical, through sheer accumulation of detail. It took 14 craftsmen, more than 4 years to carve the furniture in this single room alone. The ceiling above the bed carries scenes from Tristan und Isolde, the story of illicit love, of passion that overrides every duty, of two people who choose each other over everything they owe the world and die for it. That this was what Ludwig chose to look at when he woke up in the morning is not a decorative detail. It is the most revealing single fact about his inner life that the castle contains. Between the study and the living room sits an artificial grotto. Stalactites hang from the ceiling. A small pool with a fake waterfall occupies one end. The lighting electric, among the earliest applications of electric light in any private residence in Bavaria, could be changed to red, blue, or white at Ludwig's direction, producing effects of dawn or of the sunset light over the Tannhauser cave. He sat here in artificially colored electric light, in a fake cave inside a neo-medieval castle on the edge of the Alps, and was somewhere else entirely. Not confused. Deliberately, purposefully elsewhere, using the most advanced electrical technology of his era to be in a different century. The technology inside the building was aggressively modern throughout. Running water on all floors, flush toilets, central heating through ducts in the walls. A telephone system connecting the castle to the village below. A steam-powered dumbwaiter in the kitchen. This combination medieval iconography, romantic aesthetic, cutting-edge industrial infrastructure was characteristic of Ludwig's sensibility in ways that complicate any simple retreat from reality narrative. He was not confused about what century he lived in. He found it aesthetically intolerable. The technology made the medievalism comfortable. The medievalism made the technology bearable. He spent 172 days in the castle across his entire life. He moved into the incomplete residential quarters in May 1884, 2 years before his death. He had 172 days in the building. He had spent 17 years and 6.18 million marks creating. The throne room had no throne. The Singers' Hall had no music. The lake for the gondola had never been dug. The costs were, by 1885, untenable. His total personal debt across all 3 major building projects, Neuschwanstein, the ornate Rococo palace at Linderhof, and the Versailles-inspired complex at Herentium C, had reached 14 million marks. His annual income was approximately 4 million marks. Foreign creditors threatened to seize royal properties. The financial crisis was real. But the specific response to the crisis, the mechanism the Bavarian government chose, was something other than a financial rescue. Chapter 6. The Debunking. What insanity actually meant. 1885. 1886. Here is the claim that almost every popular account of Ludwig II reproduces without examination, that the Bavarian government, facing a financial crisis caused by the king's excessive spending, commissioned a psychiatric assessment, found him genuinely mentally ill, and had him removed from the throne by the proper constitutional processes available to them. This claim is, on the historical evidence, almost entirely false. The insanity finding was not a medical conclusion. It was a political instrument. The document that certified Ludwig insane was the Ärztliches Gutachten, the medical opinion, dated 8 June 1886, and signed by 4 psychiatrists, of whom the principal author was Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, professor of psychiatry at the University of Munich and the most eminent alienist in Bavaria. The document classified Ludwig as suffering from paranoia, a diagnostic category that, in the usage of the period, covered a wide range of conditions, including what we would now call schizophrenia, persecutory delusional disorder, and various forms of severe personality disorder. The specific symptoms cited included bizarre behavior, nocturnal lifestyle, extravagant spending, social withdrawal, violent outbursts against servants, and what was described as inappropriate emotional relationships. Here is the central fact that the document's official appearance obscures. Of the 4 psychiatrists who signed it, exactly one Dr. von Gudden himself had ever met Ludwig II in person. That meeting had taken place years earlier, in a social context, and did not involve any psychiatric examination. The other 3 signatories had never examined the king, never spoken with him, never spent any time in his presence. Their contribution was to review testimony from servants, courtiers, and officials, people with their own grievances, their own political interests, their own reasons to characterize the king's behavior in the worst possible light, and organize that testimony into a clinical-sounding document. Dr. Heinz Hefner, emeritus professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of Heidelberg and one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in 20th-century Germany, published his assessment of the Gutachten in 2008. His conclusion was unambiguous. The Gutachten was scientifically worthless by the standards of any era. It was based entirely on hearsay, compiled without examination of the subject, organized to reach a predetermined conclusion, and signed by men who either did not examine the king or did not examine him for the purpose of the report they signed. A medical opinion of this quality, Hefner argued, would not be recognized as legitimate evidence in any competent court, then or now. The question this raises is, why was the insanity route chosen? The constitutional options available to the Bavarian government for dealing with a king whose spending was causing a financial crisis were not unlimited, but they were real. They could have attempted to have Ludwig declared legally incompetent, specifically in relation to financial matters, a more limited proceeding, requiring genuine legal evidence rather than psychiatric testimony, but one that would have addressed the actual problem without removing him from the throne. They could have negotiated directly with the king. The financial danger was real enough that a sufficiently candid presentation might have produced cooperation. They could have sought constitutional amendment to the laws governing royal finances. They chose instead the most extreme option available: complete incapacitation, removal from the throne, assumption of the regency by Ludwig's uncle Luitpold, and physical custody of the king at the lakeside palace at Berg. The choice of the most extreme option makes sense only if the goal was not to address the financial crisis, but to remove Ludwig from power permanently in a way that made the removal appear medically necessary rather than politically motivated. Ludwig's ministers had additional personal motivations beyond the constitutional crisis. Several had been threatened by Ludwig with replacement and had calculated that acting first, removing him before he could remove them, was the safer path. This is not speculation. Contemporary accounts from within the cabinet document the ministers' fear of Ludwig's erratic decision-making, his reversal of decisions already made, his direct communication with officials who bypassed the cabinet structure, his threats against those who opposed him. Intolerable to govern with and incapable of governing are different things, but the ministers conflated them deliberately. The government also had a ready-made instrument of comparison. Ludwig's younger brother Otto, who was genuinely and severely mentally ill, almost certainly schizophrenic by any modern assessment, confined since 1875, incapable of performing any public function, the Gutachten explicitly invoked the existence of hereditary insanity in the Wittelsbach family, using Otto's real illness as circumstantial evidence for Ludwig's claimed illness. One brother's genuine suffering was weaponized to validate the manufactured diagnosis of the other. Hefner identifies this as among the most cynical elements of the 1,886 proceedings. What makes the picture more complex still is the evidence that Ludwig himself, on the night of his removal, did not behave like a man who had lost contact with reality. When the government commission arrived at Neuschwanstein on 10 June 1886 to deliver the notice of deposition, Ludwig organized a counter-response, had the commission arrested by his household guard, held them briefly, attempted to contact the outside world for support, and when this failed, was taken into custody on the morning of 12 June after what witnesses describe as a composed and dignified farewell to his servants. He wrote letters that night that are, by any assessment, the letters of a sane man in extraordinary distress, clear in argument, coherent in expression, addressing his specific legal situation with accuracy. The man who had been certified a paranoid incapable of governing himself wrote better letters on the night of his deposition than most politicians write on their best days. His personal physician, Dr. Friedrich Schleiss von Loewenstein, publicly disputed Gudden's certification and was rewarded with death threats. He subsequently left a diary describing what he claimed to have found at the lake on the night of Ludwig's death. But the diary has not been made publicly available, and its contents are known only through secondary accounts. Hermann Rumschüttel, whose scholarly biography of Ludwig II is the most careful academic assessment of the question, does not claim Ludwig was mentally healthy. He argues that Ludwig exhibited symptoms consistent with significant depression, pronounced social anxiety, and what contemporary psychiatry might categorize as a personality disorder of some kind, but that these conditions, even accepting the testimony of those around him at face value, did not meet the threshold of incapacitation the Gutachten claimed. Ludwig was suffering. He was not incapable of ruling. The distinction was deliberately collapsed by men who needed to remove him, and the collapse was dressed in clinical language that lent it the appearance of legitimacy it did not possess. The note Ludwig sent to one of his allies on the final night at Neuschwanstein asked simply, "Is there nobody who will help me?" There was not. Chapter 7. The Lake, 1213. June 1886. On June 1886, Ludwig II was taken from Neuschwanstein under guard. He left in the early morning, following what witnesses described as a controlled and dignified goodbye to the castle staff. He would never see it again. The carriage took him north to Schloss Berg on the eastern shore of Lake Starnberg, a small palace prepared for his reception with Dr. von Gudden installed as his physician and keeper. The rooms had no locks on the insides of the doors and no screws in the window handles, so that the rooms could be entered at any time from outside. His razor had been removed from his toilet articles. These are the precautions of a facility managing a patient considered a suicide risk. The following morning, 13 June, Ludwig walked with Gudden in the castle grounds. He was reportedly calm. At dinner he ate well. At approximately 6.3 inches the evening, he asked Gudden to accompany him on a second walk along the lake shore. Gudden agreed, sending away the orderly who had been assigned to accompany them, apparently confident he could manage the king alone. They did not return by the scheduled time of 8 p.m. At approximately 10.3 p.m., in the shallow water at the edge of the lake, approximately 100 meters from shore, in water no more than waist deep, searchers found two bodies. Ludwig was face down in the water, dead. Gudden was beside him, also dead. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6.54 p.m. Gudden had visible injuries, a significant head wound, torn fingernails consistent with grabbing at something hard in a struggle, bruising on his neck. Ludwig had no visible injuries. The official government explanation, announced before dawn on 14 June, was that Ludwig had committed suicide by drowning, and that Gudden had drowned attempting to stop him. This explanation was accepted by the Bavarian government and by most of the European press within 24 hours. No inquest was held. No independent forensic examination was conducted. The people who recovered the bodies were required to swear an oath on a crucifix and Bible never to speak publicly about what they had seen, not even on their deathbeds. This oath was administered the night of the discovery, before any formal proceedings of any kind had taken place. Consider what it means to administer a blanket oath of silence on the night of a death, before any investigation has been conducted, before any court has been convened, before any official determination of cause has been made through any legitimate process. This is not the procedure of a government confident of its account. This is the procedure of a government that knew its account would not withstand scrutiny. The autopsy was conducted by Gudden's colleagues, the same professional circle that had signed the insanity certification. It found no water in Ludwig's lungs. This is not a minor detail. A person who drowns inhales water. The water is in the lungs at autopsy. Ludwig's lungs were dry. The official ruling of death by drowning was based on an autopsy whose findings directly contradicted the cause of death, the ruling stated. The Cambridge University Library's assessment of the historical literature, compiled for the 125th anniversary of Ludwig's death, states the core paradox plainly. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. The water was less than waist deep where his body was found, and there was no water found in his lungs. Nor does the suicide theory explain the mysterious death of Dr. Gudden. Three principal theories have circulated in the historical literature since 1886. The first, the official version, is murder-suicide. Ludwig killed Gudden and then drowned himself. This requires explaining dry lungs in waist-deep water. The second, favored by the researchers at Traces of Evil, who have studied the physical evidence most carefully, is that Ludwig attempted to escape across the lake toward a waiting boat, that Gudden pursued him and a struggle followed, and that both men died, Gudden by drowning or violence, Ludwig by heart failure or hypothermia in 1-2. Degree water, complicated by being overweight, exhausted, and under extreme psychological stress. The wet clay of the lake bottom, one witness later noted, was extraordinarily difficult to extract oneself from under any condition. The third theory is assassination. The argument: the government that had just deposed Ludwig in an illegal process had strong incentives to ensure he did not live to mount a legal challenge or generate popular opposition around his confinement. A king under house arrest is a rallying point. A dead king is a closed question. The theory points to the immediate oath of silence as evidence that something was being covered up from the beginning. It points to the physician Jakob Liedel's diary, in which Liedel wrote that Ludwig was shot in the back while attempting to escape in a boat, that Liedel was required to swear he had heard no shots, in exchange for financial security for his family. That diary subsequently disappeared. Ludwig's own personal physician at Berg, Dr. Schleiss von Loewenstein, the same man who had disputed the insanity certification, left his own diary, describing discovering Ludwig had been shot. That diary was purchased by the historian Siegfried Wichmann, and its contents published, though the original was not made publicly available. Anne-Marie Ackerman, an American lawyer and historian who has produced the most careful English-language assessment of the death evidence, concludes that no single explanation is sufficient to be definitive. The absence of water in Ludwig's lungs is a genuine anomaly. The injuries on Gudden are real. The oath is real. The destroyed and disappeared evidence is real. But the murder theory faces one fundamental problem. It would have required the coordinated and sustained silence of a large number of people. The absence of a credible direct leak over nearly 140 years is, if not definitive, at least relevant. What can be said with confidence is this: the official explanation is not consistent with the physical evidence. The investigation was suppressed on the night of the discovery. The people best placed to provide evidence were sworn to silence. A proper forensic investigation was never conducted. The government that would have had to conduct such an investigation was the same government that had manufactured the insanity certification in the first place. We do not know what happened at the edge of Lake Starnberg on the evening of 13 June 1886. We will not know. The lake keeps its secret. Chapter 8. The Myth Machine, How Mad King Ludwig Was Made. 1886. Present. Ludwig II was buried on 19 June 1886. 200,000 people lined the streets of Munich for his funeral procession. The Bavarian public that had not seen him in person for years came out in numbers that surprised everyone who had convinced themselves his isolation meant unpopularity. He had not appeared in Munich for years, had governed through written notes and intermediaries, had avoided the ceremonies and public appearances that constitutional monarchy required. His ministers had used this withdrawal as evidence of incapacity. The 200,000 people in the streets said something different. It was a political rebuke, the population of a state, demonstrating that it did not accept the characterization of its king as a dangerous lunatic who had been humanely rescued from himself. Neuschwanstein was open to paying tourists on 1 August, 1886, 6 weeks after his death. The building he had constructed as a private refuge designed to be, in his own words, holy and unapproachable, was immediately converted into a revenue-generating attraction. The castle, closed to all visitors during his life, was open to the public before his memory was cold. The stated rationale was debt management. The building costs needed to be recouped. The administrators of Ludwig's estate balanced the construction debts by 1899, 13 years after his death. From then until 1914, the castle was probably the single largest income source earned by the Bavarian royal family. The man declared a dangerous financial liability by his own government paid off his own debts from the grave within 13 years. The construction costs that had partly justified his deposition were recouped and profit generated within the same decade he died. Nobody appears to have found this uncomfortable. The Mad King Ludwig narrative that calcified in the decades following his death was not the product of disinterested historical assessment. It was produced by the same political establishment that had deposed him, which had obvious institutional interests in ensuring the deposition appeared medically necessary rather than politically motivated. The insanity diagnosis provided the interpretive frame within which everything Ludwig had done could be reread as symptom. The building projects were evidence of grandiose delusion. The social withdrawal was evidence of paranoid isolation. The obsession with Wagner was evidence of unhealthy fixation. The broken engagement to his cousin Sophie Charlotte was evidence of inability to form normal adult relationships. The nocturnal lifestyle he had long since reversed his days and nights, conducting his business between midnight and dawn, was evidence of disordered thinking. The preference for private theatrical performances rather than public ceremonies was evidence of detachment from reality. Each biographical fact was converted, retroactively, into a clinical symptom. The problem is that the clinical symptoms and the defining biographical facts are the same things. You cannot use the biographical facts as evidence for the diagnosis and simultaneously use the diagnosis to explain the biographical facts. This is circular reasoning dressed in medical language. It proves nothing except that if you decide someone is mad, their behavior will appear to confirm it. The method could be applied to almost any sufficiently eccentric historical figure, with the same result applied to Beethoven, to William Blake, to El Greco, to any number of figures whose peculiarities of personality are now celebrated as evidence of genius rather than illness, because those figures died before they became politically inconvenient to anyone with the power to have them certified. The government also deployed Ludwig's younger brother Otto, genuinely and severely mentally ill, almost certainly schizophrenic, confined since 1875, as circumstantial evidence for hereditary insanity. One brother's genuine suffering was weaponized to validate the manufactured diagnosis of the other. This is the element that Hefner identifies as among the most cynical in the entire 1886 proceeding. What Ludwig actually was, as distinct from what the posthumous diagnostic industry made of him, is a genuine historical question that cannot be answered with certainty, but can be approached honestly. Room Shuttle's assessment is the most careful available. Ludwig was probably significantly depressed across much of his adult life. He suffered from pronounced social anxiety that worsened markedly after his 20s. He exhibited the kind of increasingly rigid withdrawal consistent with a significant personality disorder of some kind. He was also highly intelligent, well-read, politically perceptive on subjects that interested him, capable of sustained administration when he chose to apply himself, and possessed of a genuine aesthetic vision whose products remain among the most visited buildings in Europe. The man who produced Neuschwanstein was not in good mental health. He was also not insane in any meaningful clinical sense. These two things are not contradictory. They are both true. The gap between them is where the political manipulation happened. The Disney connection completed the transformation of the Mad King narrative into something globally exportable. When Herbert Ryman drew concept art for Sleeping Beauty Castle in 1954, working on a single weekend at Walt Disney's urgent request, he based the design on Neuschwanstein's silhouette, the white limestone, the clustered towers, the alpine drama of a fairytale castle against mountain sky. Ryman described the instruction directly: to base it on King Ludwig's Bavarian castle. Sleeping Beauty Castle opened at Disneyland on 17 July, 1955. Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World opened in 1971. The Disney corporate logo, the castle silhouette that precedes every Disney film, seen by hundreds of millions of people annually as the symbol of imaginative escape and childhood wonder, is derived from a building that a man was forcibly removed from 2 days before his death, under circumstances that were never investigated. This overlay of innocent association did not displace the Mad King story. It coexisted with it, providing a veneer of benign whimsy that made the story easier to tell without fully examining Mad King. Beautiful Castle, Disney's favorite, tragic end. Move along to the gift shop. In the final weeks of the Second World War, the castle served a purpose that neither Ludwig nor Disney could have anticipated. Nazi authorities, facing the Allied advance, used Neuschwanstein's remote location as a depot for looted art treasures seized from Jewish collections and families across occupied Europe, transported to the castle for concealment. American forces, arriving in April 1945, found approximately 6,000 paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects in the castle and its outbuildings. An attempt to destroy the collection ordered under the Nero Decree was intercepted and stopped. The looted art was repatriated, gradually and incompletely, over the following decades. Some items remain unidentified or unrestored to their owners' families. The castle that Ludwig built as a refuge from everything the modern world represented spent the end of its first century as a warehouse for the worst thing the modern world had done. Since 2025, Neuschwanstein is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the palaces of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The inscription acknowledges what Ludwig created with the precision that UNESCO inscriptions characteristically deploy. Outstanding universal value, a unique artistic achievement, the finest expression of 19th-century historicist architecture in the world. The inscription does not address the circumstances of the creator's death. It does not address the fraudulent medical certification. It addresses the buildings. The human story that produced them is, from the UNESCO framework's perspective, background, context. It is the context. Chapter 9. The question the lake will not answer. What the Neuschwanstein really is. It is the world's most photographed castle. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2025. It receives 1.3 million visitors a year and generates approximately €13 million in annual ticket revenue. The construction debts were paid off in 1899. Tourism revenue since then runs into many hundreds of millions of euros. The man declared a dangerous financial liability by his own government has generated, in the 140 years since his death, a return on his building investment that no Bavarian finance minister could have predicted, and no Bavarian finance minister has ever publicly acknowledged with any particular discomfort. It is the original of every Disney castle. The logo that precedes every Disney film is an echo of this building. Hundreds of millions of people encounter a version of Neuschwanstein before they know what Neuschwanstein is, and most of them will never know. Because the Disney castle does not carry a label explaining its origin, and the Disney Corporation has no institutional interest in advertising, that its symbol of wholesome family imagination was derived from a building whose creator was found dead in suspicious circumstances 2 days after being removed from it by force. It is the physical record of a medieval knightly dynasty, the Schwangau family, their 4 centuries of alpine passage control, their Minnesinger poet Hiltbolt with his black swan emblem, their extinction in 1536, whose actual stones were cleared away to build what replaced them. The knight who sang of courtly love in the courts of Frederick II and Henry VI occupies no commemorative plaque at Neuschwanstein. His name appears in scholarly catalogues of medieval German poetry. His ridge was sold by his descendants, his castle demolished, and a theater designer's fantasy erected in its place. The authentic medieval history was physically removed to create a more aesthetically satisfying version of it. It is the record of a political deposition dressed in fraudulent medical language, committed by ministers who feared for their own positions as much as they feared for Bavaria's finances, whose primary legal instrument was a psychiatric certification signed by 3 men who had never met the person they were certifying insane, and whose consequences were permanent and irreversible within 48 hours. It is the record of a suspicious death that was never investigated, whose official account contradicts its own physical evidence, whose witnesses were sworn to silence on the night of the death, whose perpetrators, whoever they were never named, charged, or held accountable, and whose sealed records have never been fully opened. It is what happens to a man's most intimate creation when he is removed from it by force and found dead 2 days later. It becomes a commodity, immediately, by the people who removed him. The transformation of a private sanctuary into a public revenue source was accomplished within 6 weeks before the grave was cold, by the same government that had manufactured the justification for the removal. This is one of the cleaner expressions of institutional power in 19th-century European history. Not only removing the person, but immediately monetizing what he had made. All of these things are simultaneously the same building. Walk through the throne room without a throne, the bedroom with the Tristan ceiling, the singer's hall where Wagner's music was never heard, the artificial grotto with its colored electric lights, and you are walking through the private geography of a man's inner life, made public against his will, by the same people who removed him from it. The tour takes 35 minutes. The groups are capped at 35 people. The gift shop closes at 7 p.m. Hermann Rummschuttel frames the architecture with precision. Ludwig's building projects were not merely escapism. They were a systematic response to political powerlessness, an attempt to create, in stone and paint, the kind of sovereignty that the political arrangements of his time denied him. Neuschwanstein was not a palace. It was a manifesto. What it said was, "Here is the world as it should be. I know the world is not like this. I am building it anyway." A manifesto, not a fairy tale. There is a difference between a man confused about reality and a man who understood reality clearly and deliberately rejected it. Ludwig's retreat into the medieval was not a symptom of incapacity. It was a considered response to a specific political situation by a man whose aesthetic intelligence was far in excess of his political options. He could not govern meaningfully. He could not resist Bismarck. He could not recover Bavarian sovereignty. He could build a castle above the gorge where the Schwangau knights had stood, and fill it with the images and sounds that represented everything the world he was forced to inhabit was not. That the castle is one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe is not despite this, but partly because of it. The intensity of the need drove the intensity of the creation. A small cross stands in Lake Starnberg at the spot where the bodies were found. It has stood there since 1886. People still leave flowers. Ludwig himself once wrote, "I want to remain an eternal mystery to myself and to others." He was granted that wish in a form he did not intend. The mystery is not the one he meant, not the mystery of a private inner world withheld from public scrutiny. It is the mystery of a death that was closed before it was opened, sealed before it was examined, officially resolved before anyone had established what had actually occurred. The water at that point is approximately 65 centimeters deep. It has been measured. Ludwig was 179 centimeters tall. He did not drown in water that came up to his thighs on a still June evening as a strong swimmer, with no water in his lungs. The alternative explanations are various, and none is proven. What is proven is only this: the official explanation is not consistent with the physical evidence. Everything beyond that is inference, theory, and the kinds of questions that powerful institutions can make permanently unanswerable by suppressing the evidence on the night it is found. The castle that stands above the gorge of the Polat stream was first fortified by the Knight of the Swan country in 1090. Hiltbolt von Schwangau sang of love and longing in its halls in the 13th century. The last Schwangau sold it in 1535, and the line died out the following year. 2.5 centuries of abandonment, bear hunts, and Austrian plundering followed. Then a crown prince went for a hike and saw ruins in a landscape and decided to rebuild them. His son grew up among those rebuilt walls, surrounded by painted images of Lohengrin and the Swan Knights, and looked up at the ruins of the original medieval castles on the ridge above, and saw something to be rebuilt there too. He built it. He spent 172 days in it. He was removed from it by force. 2 days later he was dead in shallow water. The cause was never established. The castle was opened within 6 weeks. 900 years of continuous human meaning on that ridge. The singer, the soldier, the desperate builder, the deposed king, and now 1.3 million people a year. A 3-5-minute guided tour, and a gift shop. The cross is still there. The lake is still beautiful. The question the lake will not answer is not who killed Ludwig II. It is whether anyone was ever going to be held accountable for it. The answer, 140 years later, is no.